Pamela Harriman was born on March 20th, 1920, into the Digby family, a lineage that balanced a certain nobility against the realities of finances and tradition. Officially, she was Pamela Beryl Digby, but that stately name did not spare her from early discomfort. In fact, her first cradle was no cradle at all, but rather a drawer at the bottom of an old wooden chest. It was a short-term arrangement, a quaint, improvised resting place before she took her place within Minturn Magna, the family's grand property in Dorset. Despite that cushy inheritance, Pamela's life was destined to stray far from the isolation of Minturna. She would soon become intimately acquainted with independence, travel, and eventually a string of influential lovers who would transform her from a restless country girl into one of the most bewitching and powerful women of her time. The Digbys might have had enough resources to keep up appearances, but they were still subject to the eccentricities of an upper-class existence. Their restlessness was evident early on. When Pamela was not even 2, her parents decided to relocate the family to Australia, allegedly chasing friendlier tax laws and more vibrant opportunities abroad. Yet this journey laid the groundwork for Pamela's sense of independence. Her parents left on their schedule, and she was placed on a ship under the care of a nanny, traveling entirely separate from them. This was not unusual in certain corners of British high society, where children were often raised at arm's length by caretakers. For Pamela, though, it left a lasting imprint. From that tender age, she learned that if she wanted support or attention, she was unlikely to find it from her distant mother and father. In Australia, Pamela's earliest vocabulary-building partner was a chatty parrot, from which she gleaned basic words and picked up a taste for mimicry. That capacity for imitation would come in handy later. She was known to entertain people by replicating Winston Churchill's distinctive growl or switching effortlessly into the refined accent of French aristocracy. Another skill she developed as a tot was riding horses. Rather than a fatherly figure guiding her, it was a pair of polo-playing brothers, friends of her father's, who taught her the fundamentals of equestrianism. From them, she gathered more than the basics of riding. She caught the thrill of competition, a thirst for self-confidence, and a recognition that if she wanted to shine, she had to keep practicing, refining her gifts, and eventually show them off in front of an audience. By 1924, the family was back on their large estate in Dorset, where 1,400 acres of sprawling countryside practically begged for gallops across fields. Before too long, Pamela was performing at equestrian shows, fearlessly jumping hurdles and reveling in the spotlight. But that sense of freedom on horseback was an outlier. The rest of her day-to-day existence felt stifled. Minturn Magna was beautiful and expansive, but with so few people around, Pamela's sociable personality had little chance to thrive. Her only close-in-age companion was her sister Sheila, a girl very much her opposite, quiet, fond of solitary hunts in the nearby woods, and generally uninterested in the whirlwind of social possibilities that Pamela craved. The tension between them was constant. Sheila was content with silent, private amusements, while Pamela dreamed of city lights, interesting acquaintances, and conversation that sparked her curiosity. Still, there was no easy way out for a young woman in that era. Her father believed in tradition, so the best concession he offered was eventually to send Pamela, along with Sheila, to a boarding school in Hertfordshire called Downham. Here, she studied home economics and learned the usual finishing school lessons. In her recollections, though, Pamela found those years trivial. She was more excited by the potential that came afterward, a chance to spend time at a finishing school in Paris, to practice the language, to polish her manners, and perhaps to meet interesting people. What she learned there, however, was overshadowed by a grand pattern that would shape her life. Pamela was prone to embellishing her achievements. Later, she would claim she had completed more rigorous academic studies than she actually had, telling new acquaintances that her schooling in Paris was postgraduate work at the Sorbonne. In truth, no records corroborate that she ever received an official diploma. One friend of hers later remarked that, with Pamela, it's always hard to find where the truth lies. Still, these half-truths and polished versions of her story were part of Pamela's brand. She recognized that certain illusions could open doors. When she first arrived in Paris, she was still naive in many ways. Curly red hair, wide-eyed innocence, and an unshakable sense that excitement must be around every corner. She'd rarely interacted with men outside of carefully supervised events, so romance was a tantalizing mystery. She carried a chaperone with her practically at all times. This was still a girl from an upper-crust background, after all, but her curiosity about the broader world bubbled beneath the surface. She discovered she could slip away on errands, watch the swirl of Parisian life, and dream of how to break free. Then came a chance to move to Munich, though the timing could hardly have been worse. 1938 placed her in the heart of Nazi Germany's ideological capital. The city was brimming with uniformed soldiers, symbols of Hitler's regime at every turn. Even so, Pamela was not overtly alarmed. She was fascinated by spectacle. According to her own later claims, she even managed a curious meeting, sipping tea with Hitler himself, arranged by a certain Unity Mitford. Yet the details in Pamela's retelling were always murky, leading close friends and historians to doubt whether this meeting truly occurred. It may have been pure invention, one more colorful flourish in a life that would soon be jam-packed with dramatic stories. Whatever the truth, by 1938 Pamela was back in Britain and thoroughly bored by the dull routine of Minturn. Then a gift arrived for her 19th birthday that changed everything, a green Jaguar. Suddenly she had the means to come and go as she wished. Country lanes had never seen such flamboyant high-speed escapes. She spent weekends in London or Leeds flirting with older friends of the family, attending parties, and ignoring any scolding from her parents. Her reckless streak was emerging in full force, reminiscent of her great-great-aunt Jane Digby, a famous courtesan known for crossing continents and collecting lovers. Pamela, it turned out, had inherited a healthy measure of that adventurous spirit. She had little interest in boys her own age, preferring men who carried an air of sophistication, perhaps a dash of wealth, and definitely the sense that they possessed experiences to share. One of these was Fulk Warwick, a divorcee she met in 1939. 11 years her senior, with a child of his own, Warwick had the means and the confidence that drew her in. One weekend at Leeds Castle, Pamela simply vanished, leaving no clue to her whereabouts until she reappeared Monday morning, blithely announcing that she'd spent a delightful few days in Paris with Warwick. Her account included details of dancing, late nights, and jade earrings he'd gifted her, but also stern assurances that, in spite of appearances, the two never ended up in bed together. Society tongues wagged nonetheless. Pamela did not care. She enjoyed the scandal, the sense that she was controlling her own narrative. Ultimately, the squeamish Warwick bowed out, deciding to avoid further gossip for both their sakes. Pamela was unfazed and promptly turned to new amusements. She was also an incorrigible gambler, racking up significant debt at the races or in late-night poker games, then turning on her powers of persuasion, tears in some cases, to escape any consequences. If she lost large sums, she coaxed her father to reimburse her. If she owed money to acquaintances, she would wheedle forgiveness. Each success reinforced her confidence. If life was a game of chance, she believed she could consistently tip the odds in her favor. In time, she found herself in London, working a small role at the Foreign Office, where her path intersected with Randolph Churchill, son of Winston Churchill, a man quickly rising in prominence as World War II loomed. Randolph's reputation was that of a reckless spender, a heavy drinker, and a somewhat desperate romantic. Legend has it, he had already proposed to multiple women in the weeks before meeting Pamela. That night, he'd hoped to invite another woman to dinner, but since she was unavailable, she suggested that he take Pamela. Within 2 dates, he proposed marriage, and Pamela accepted, though not for love, at least not in the traditional sense. She recognized Randolph's political significance and the escape he offered from her stifling home. Randolph, for his part, wanted a wife to accompany him during a precarious time. Winston Churchill, seeing an opportunity, fully supported the union. He needed his son to produce an heir, especially with war on the horizon, and a charming, fertile bride like Pamela was the perfect solution. She was whisked into the Churchill family, quickly discovering that married life was not all glamorous dinners and gracious in-laws. Randolph's temper, fueled by liquor, was legendary. He would publicly embarrass her, stomp around the house shouting insults, and vanish for days on end. Bills piled up because he spent money he did not have. Pamela was forced to lean on Winston Churchill himself for financial assistance. Despite that friction, she fulfilled her father-in-law's chief hope by giving birth to a son on October 10, 1940, named Winston, after his grandfather. If her marriage was rocky before, motherhood did not improve it. Randolph disappeared for military service, leaving Pamela alone, restless, and starved for affection. She found it in the arms of a distinctly older, powerful American diplomat, Averell Harriman, a special envoy of President Franklin Roosevelt, and a millionaire to boot. The fact that Harriman was married did not deter them from a torrid clandestine affair. He was nearly 30 years her senior, but she relished the thrill of an affair with a formidable man. Over the next few years, while Randolph was away, Pamela took other lovers as well, systematically choosing men of wealth or influence. One was John Hay Whitney, another was famed broadcaster Edward Murrow, from whom she begged to leave his wife. He made vague promises, but never followed through. The pattern was clear. Pamela wanted to be with men who offered status, security, and the possibility of excitement. If they were married, well, that was an inconvenience, but not a deal breaker. In exchange, she became known as a consummate lover, keenly attuned to men's desires, ready to try anything to keep them satisfied. This earned her the label, the greatest courtesan of the century. She wore it like a medal, aware that in a man's world sexual allure could be her currency. Her own son, Winston Churchill Jr., would later claim that Pamela's devotion to her many relationships left him neglected, particularly on Christmases. Randolph, too, branded her with derogatory terms, calling her whore or W-word. She refused to let such condemnations weigh her down. To her, the arrangement was clear. For a woman in the 1940s, financial freedom was inextricably linked to the men she could captivate. Her strategy was to cultivate the best possible alliances. She once dabbled in a brief affair with Prince Ali Khan, son of Sultan Aga Khan, though for both of them it was more a pit stop than a serious partnership. He would go on to marry Rita Hayworth, while Pamela continued her quest for the greatest love or advantage she could find. By 1945, World War II's close signaled the unraveling of her marriage. She divorced Randolph, citing desertion and moral failings on his part. Almost immediately after, she embarked on what she would call the happiest period of her life. In 1948, she met Johnny Agnelli, heir to the Fiat Empire, a wealthy playboy of impeccable style. He gave her a posh apartment in New York, a chauffeur-driven car, and even managed to impress her usually suspicious father when he visited. In exchange for this luxurious lifestyle, Pamela essentially coordinated Johnny's personal affairs, from scheduling to entertaining. She even converted to Catholicism, presumably to strengthen their bond. Yet, as with so many of Pamela's men, Agnelli refused to commit wholeheartedly. He enjoyed a rotating lineup of mistresses, and his relationship with Pamela was just one more fling in a sea of them. Pamela caught him red-handed with other lovers, confronted him, stomped her feet in protest, but he never changed. Then came a car crash that severely injured his leg, and ironically, Pamela rushed to nurse him. As if fate could not resist a cruel twist, she soon discovered she was pregnant. Rather than keep the baby, she opted for an abortion in Switzerland, well aware that any child with a playboy father would hardly yield the stable marriage she craved. Meanwhile, Agnelli was impregnating a princess. That was the final straw for Pamela. She left him, concluding that he would never marry her. Next, she drifted briefly into the arms of the Baron de Rothschild, gleaning an education in art history and winemaking. At the same time, she carried on with multiple suitors. She gave the Baron a marriage ultimatum, but, ever practical, made sure she had backup. Soon, she was out with Leland Hayward, a Broadway producer famed for bringing hits like South Pacific and The Sound of Music to the stage. With her usual blend of grace and flattery, she intrigued him. She appreciated the glamour of show business, the chance to learn from him. By the time her standoff with Rothschild collapsed, she had pivoted fully to Hayward, who eventually left his own marriage to marry Pamela as his fifth wife. This new partnership brought her a measure of stability at last. They lived between an apartment in Manhattan and an estate in Westchester County. For 11 years, she was the gracious, well-heeled hostess who charmed dinner guests, kept house staff in line, and expertly managed their social calendar. But Hayward passed away in 1971, and with his death, the question of inheritance emerged. Hayward's children from previous marriages disliked Pamela's sense of entitlement. They felt she had used her charm to get more than her fair share, though the will left half of his holdings to them, meaning she was hardly made destitute. Indeed, it was enough to keep her comfortable. Yet, within a single day of the funeral, Pamela arranged a meeting with an old flame, Averil Harriman, now 79 and newly widowed. If the timing raised eyebrows, Pamela did not care. She had always operated on an opportunistic timeline, and Harriman was a wealthy man with even more enviable connections than before. People whispered that she was the widow of opportunity. The label was apt. Within 6 months, they married. Averil was decades older, but their union allowed Pamela to step into a new, powerful circle. Harriman's involvement with the Democratic Party offered exactly the kind of political inroad Pamela had never before been able to claim for herself. Armed with American citizenship, a Harriman surname, and a thirst for influence, Pamela threw herself into fundraising for the Democrats. She played a key role in launching a political action committee affectionately dubbed PAMPAC, garnering donations from wealthy acquaintances and forging alliances with key figures in Washington. By 1980, the National Women's Democratic Club named her Woman of the Year. She was firmly established as a political force. Such accolades would have bewildered the British aristocrats who had sneered at her decades before, refusing to let her attend certain embassy events for fear of tarnishing the guest list. Pamela had leveraged her scandalous reputation into genuine influence. As the years rolled on, she only grew bolder in her ambitions. In 1986, Averil Harriman died, leaving Pamela with an inheritance of around $115 million, but not without complications. His children accused her of squandering the fortune through poor investments. Facing a civil lawsuit, she had to sell off part of her impressive art collection. including masterpieces by Picasso, Renoir, and Matisse. Though surely painful, these obstacles did not derail her for long. She was fixed on a bigger prize, real political clout in America. With Bill Clinton's inauguration in 1993, that dream materialized spectacularly. He appointed Pamela as the United States ambassador to France. It was a twist of fate so grand that even Pamela's imagination might never have conjured it back in the days when the British embassy had dismissed her as that tart. Now she was the official representative of the U.S., forging diplomatic ties in the country where she'd once studied, partied, and learned to spin tall tales about meeting Hitler. For 4 years, Pamela Harriman served in Paris, throwing her formidable social talents behind NATO, expansion negotiations, international trade deals, and the general business of fostering U.S.-French relations. She delighted in the pageantry of high diplomacy. After all, this was the same woman who had spent her youth cultivating charm, seduction, and an uncanny ability to make influential men feel admired and valued. Her arsenal of social skills proved surprisingly useful in the quarters of political power. If critics found her rise improbable, that did not concern her. By the mid-90s, she was recognized as one of the most successful female diplomats in modern U.S. history, an achievement few would have predicted when she was burning through men's wallets to pay for fancy dinners in London, or skipping out on her gambling debts with a well-timed tear. Her death came as dramatically as one might expect from such a storied figure. In 1997, while taking a dip in the pool at the Paris Ritz, she suffered a cerebral hemorrhage. She was found there, and despite rushed medical attention, she did not recover. She passed away at 76 years old, having lived a life that soared above the constraints faced by most women of her generation. At her funeral, Bill Clinton spoke generously of her contributions to public service, and the President of France offered his respects. It was a final sign that Pamela Harriman, once deemed too scandalous for embassy receptions, had made good on her vow to shape her own destiny. Of course, not everyone was sad to see her go. Some people remembered the trail of heartbreak and betrayal she had left in her wake. Randolph Churchill had seethed over her repeated infidelities, calling her a name so infamous her own son repeated it in his adult recollections. Winston Churchill Jr. resented how she had neglected him in favor of a rotating cast of lovers. The children of Leland Hayward nursed a grudge over contested inheritances. The Harriman heirs accused her of devouring the family fortune. Yet despite it all, Pamela's story stands as a testament to the sheer force of will she possessed. She believed she deserved the best life had to offer and used every tool at her disposal: her wit, her seduction, her social intelligence to vault herself into a realm of privilege and diplomacy. Critics might label her a fortune hunter, a courtesan, or an opportunist. Admirers might see her as a trailblazer who refused to be pigeonholed by gender norms. In truth, she was probably both, a woman forging her own path in a time that rarely allowed women to do so on their own terms. The final irony is that the very embassy that once barred her from a reception because of her supposed moral failings became the seat of her power. She served as U.S. ambassador to France in the iconic building that had, in different circumstances, symbolized exclusivity for the British upper crust. She arrived at that station, having married 3 influential men and taken many more lovers, each stepping stone placed precisely to carry her toward a life that satisfied her thirst for recognition. From that naive girl who lied about receiving a bachelor's degree to the official, widely respected Ambassador Harriman, she had come full circle. Yet perhaps what defined her more than any fancy title was her unwavering determination to seize every opportunity to gather power, and to taste a life that few women of her era even dared to imagine. By the time of her death, she had shaped not only her own legacy, but also the fortunes and fates of countless men who fell under her spell. In the end, Pamela Harriman's story exemplifies the notion that scandal and influence can coexist, often feeding into each other. She owned her rebellious streak from the moment she commandeered that green Jaguar to the day she casually reconnected with Averill Harriman just a day after burying her second husband. She mastered the art of pleasing wealthy men and gleaning from them the resources to forge her own destiny. And while many critics might question her morals, few would deny that she left a lasting mark. She became the last courtesan, an emblem of how a woman gifted with wit, confidence, and strategic cunning can manipulate the rigid structures of wealth and power to her advantage. Her name remains an object lesson, shocking, impressive, and undeniably captivating, just like the woman herself.